Hey everyone, it's been a couple days off. Not off of work, but off of this video series. It's been a busy start to the week, so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday got away from me. Um, so welcome back to the series. Um, Episode, I think this is 11. We've up to this point covered a variety of planning topics, including mission and vision, um, environmental scan, the relationship of planning to culture, and the way to think about cascading plans. Today, which would have been this week, but we're a little bit late on the start, we would be talking about, and we are going to talk about, or start talking about execution or execution frameworks, if you want to think about it that way, because there's lots of ways to move from a plan to action, to implementation. And so this period, which will probably be the end of this week and next week, we'll talk about execution frameworks and the relationships they have to higher level plans. I think frequently, um, because people are either inexperienced at planning or because planning is not familiar or it belongs to a separate function, it's done in one sphere, and then there's this sort of cold handoff of that plan to another sphere. I'll give you an example. So, an enterprise architecture organization might work for a chief financial officer or even a CIO, and they may create an enterprise architecture strategy, which is really the relationship of the business and the business capabilities and functions and processes, the data and information, the software and information systems, and then lastly, the technology, the infrastructure. And so, and they can include everything from the data centers to the network to the desktops, to basically anything um, that hosts data or software. It's kind of the nature there. Um, so an enterprise architecture organization may create such a plan, by capability, by segment, the entirety, high level, low level. But regardless, they may do that over here in service of a particular leader. And then that leader's, again, CFO, CIO, COO in some cases, will take that plan, stamp it, approve it, agree with it, and then move to his teams, and or again, if it's a separate organization, move to the rest of the organization. CFO frequently, if they have architecture and strategy and compliance, typically it's a compliance and risk function when it's in the CFO's office. But regardless, when there's this enterprise-wide compliance, risk, governance, strategy um, plan that comes comes out from an organization, um, there's this moment when the leader pivots and it spins his chair, so to speak, to the rest of the organization. That spin frequently creates a gap. It's not an integrated spin, and what I mean by that is the plan might be sent to all the managers, and the managers say, okay, I understand, or leaders or whatever. For example, it could be a director, executive directors, associate vice presidents, deputy chief technology officers, chief information officers. Anyway, anybody, any second and third in command may take this plan and understand it and presumably read it. Sometimes well, sometimes not. And then it's up to them ultimately to do stuff, and then have that doing of the stuff uh, be generate evidence that they did the stuff, and that evidence would be sent on some period, quarterly, monthly, yearly, to back to this leader or back to the planning organization. Again, sometimes it's a risk organization, sometimes it's a compliance organization, sometimes it's a planning organization, sometimes it's a strategy organization, sometimes it's an enterprise architecture organization. But regardless, that period, that regularity, that check-in, monthly, quarterly, yearly, um, you know, you throw it back over the wall, so to speak, to that group. And so, and then that group's now got the responsibility to take the evidence that's provided to them and kind of interpret it and ask questions about it. And in some cases suggests that maybe that evidence doesn't really support that you achieved the outcome, doesn't really suggest you actually accomplished the objective. And again, we talked about goals and objectives in past um, episodes. So there's this, I hate to say disconnect, but in larger organizations especially, there's this volley of plan from the planners and evidence to suggest that they've executed, lobbed back. So plan comes across, evidence goes back. Plans comes across, evidence goes back. Questions about the evidence come across, further and subsequent evidence come, and so the nature of that back and forth volley leads, in some cases it's necessary, and I'll say how it's necessary first, but then let's talk about some of the negatives that happen when execution is that divorced or that separate from planning. Now, in some cases, it's necessary because in some cases, or at least in some cases, the perception is that it's necessary um, based on a number of seemingly valid to very valid factors. One is if you're in a very, very large organization and you are a centralized planning, governance, compliance, risk group creating plans, it's a lot of stakeholders to work across. And the idea that all those stakeholders are going to have the same approach or even be able to have the same approach, right? If you're dealing across manufacturing and finance and HR and logistics and supply chain and a services group and sales and support. Anyway, there's so many different functions that may be able to work within the plan to satisfy it or really execute the plan. That the decoupling of the plan from the execution, the strong decoupling, where there's this, I'll call it a strong interface, right? Plan is the inputs, evidence are the outputs, and so there's this loose coupling, and then there's a really strong interface. Is so that there's not a assumed or presumed execution. I'll call it again framework. Paradigm might be a better word, because in some cases these will be projects. In some cases these are operational metrics. For example, a support organization or a sales organization may have revenue targets or NPI, net promoter scores, or other such customer satisfaction metrics, or parts, manufactured parts per day, per hour. Anyway, things that are not fixed outcomes, but enduring outcomes measured on control, whether something's in control or out of control based on an ongoing metric. So in some cases, those groups are not doing what we'll call projects, outcomes. And again, these could be small things, big things, but at the objective level, when a set of objectives are thrown across the wall in a plan to an executing group, that executing group, is very often going to be in a completely different paradigm from another executing group. So that loose coupling of planners and plan to evidence and execution is sometimes needed, or again, it's a convenient way to federate the process, we'll say. The impact, though, of that is two things. Two, what I would call very negative, illegitimizing, and I say illegitimizing because I think it ultimately illegitimizes the plan. Side effects of that approach, of the loosely coupled planning and execution processes with a strong but somewhat coarsely grained interface between. Again, when I say coarsely grained interface, I'm literally talking about plan comes over, evidence comes back, right? Is absent some very specific guidelines, it eventually devolves or can devolve into box checking by the execution groups. So the people who are actually supposed to meet these goals or objectives, maybe we'll say, frequently, because there is such a strong separation or a loose coupling between planners and execution groups, or groups executing the plan, and because of the wall notion, it's like throw it over the wall, throw it over the wall, throw it over the wall, throw it over the wall. So because of that, there is a tendency to not really buy into the plan. Meaning, I've got my work to do, and then they've got this external group coming in, giving me plans, goals, whatever. And so, sure, I guess, yes, I'll provide evidence to them on a quarterly basis. But I don't. It's like seems separate and not relevant to my day to day. And it's a shame. We talked briefly about several frameworks that cascade, or planning approaches that cascade. And one of the benefits of cascading planning, right, is there's strong linkage between the things people are doing in the trenches and the higher level plan. And so one other side effect of not having strong linkage, in addition to whether it's resistance or perfunctory box checking or a lack of buy-in or however that works, is unless the group, and this takes a unique culture to do this well, and when it's not done well, it can take two flavors, both of which are dysfunctional. Um, but you end up with the planning group, again, whether it's risk, compliance, enterprise architecture, strategy, whatever that group is and called, but they are producing plans for the rest of the organization, right? Or maybe you're a smaller business and you don't have all that mess, and you're a leadership team or a leader producing plans that the rest of the group is going to execute on. Two things can happen. Number one, you will, as a planner or as a leader, check in with that group to say, oh, here's the plan we all agreed to. Everybody cool with that? Yep, okay. How's it going? And so you'll check in with them. And so even if it's not as heavy as evidence across the wall and evidence, in some cases the organization won't be quite that complicated. You may have a status report meeting. So one of two things will happen. Either the leader or planning group receiving the evidence, receiving the feedback, receiving the report out, whatever flavor it takes. Basically, the guy or guys or gals, whatever, receiving the evidence, and again, that can come in written evidence, verbal evidence, whatever, will either be too lax. And by that, what I mean is back to the notion of SMART. Objectives should be specific, realistic, actionable, specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time bound. But even when they are, there is a measure of subjectivity, particularly in high level plans, as to the degree evidence and accomplishment does in fact satisfy and accomplish the original objective. And what I mean by that is it's really easy as a leader, unless you want to be what could be perceived as a jerk or detail-oriented or micromanaging or whatever, or a planner even, to take evidence perfunctorily and go, yay, we did some stuff, which you might have, and it might be worth celebrating the evidence of good activity that's happened during execution. It may be great, and so it's worth some celebration. But unless that leader or that planning group has a critical eye to the extent to which the evidence truly satisfied the objective, you will it will devolve these conversations, this exchange, whether it's over the wall or whether it's verbal and it's interpersonal, this exchange would devolve into meaningless drivel. You won't be moving the organization towards the plan, because one of the things that's true is, especially at a planning level, this stuff's additive. So all the objectives add up to meeting the goal. And so if you cheat a little bit in this objective, and you cheat a little bit in this objective, and you cheat a little bit in this objective, you will move the organization forward, but I can tell you, you may not reach your goal. So this is where that's sort of outcome number one in the dysfunction. So dysfunctional outcome number one is you will not accomplish your goals because you'll be so interested as planners or as leaders in honoring the good work people are doing, which is good, that you won't be critical when they're not quite meeting the goal or the objective, I'll say. And in the other extreme, which of course is also dysfunctional and can be quite demoralizing, is when you have a leader who's so committed to the plan, or a planner that's so committed to the plan that they get real fastidious. They get, and again, in some cases it calls for that, but the approach to doing that, to being, I'll call it critical, and I don't mean negatively critical, I just mean a critical eye, analysis of the evidence relevant to or relative to the objective, is you come across organizationally as really nitpicky, whether you're the planning group or the leader, and so this is where that becomes a balance. And so let me tell you that happens when there's this loose coupling. I will argue in future weeks, and in particular starting tomorrow, if time permits, and I think it will, that if you're able to more strongly couple planning and execution, so that there's less of a volley between the two and more of an explicit link by design, and therefore an implied link in the conversation around success or completion, maybe a better way to say it, um, of an objective, satisfaction and completion of an objective. If that's set up in the framework and set up from the start, you're less likely to have these two dysfunctions. Either a control heavy planning organization that leads to this kind of like nitpicky culture, or a leader that could be criticized as being nitpicky. You won't be in that situation as much because you will have pre-established for good reasons. So you want there to be this link between planning and execution that's strong and tightly coupled. And so what we'll talk about in subsequent episodes is how those get linked in a way that's productive, in a way that doesn't lead to nitpicky, but also doesn't lead to soft leadership or soft planning and governance. Yeah, it's good to see you again. A little bit longer episode, but I had some stuff to catch up on. So have a wonderful Thursday, and I hope you are doing well during this plan to thrive season of coronavirus. Hope y'all are well.